The title of this talk is Symbiogenesis, which is not familiar to most of you, I'm sure. It's the missing link between physics and evolution, and it is greatly important in understanding what consciousness, in my opinion, actually is. Having been a bench scientist for 50 years and over the last 20 or 25 years writing about what consciousness is from the perspective of physiology. So I thought I would roll this out by showing this image that David Foster Wallace generated at Kenyon College in 2005. There are these two little fish on the right, and there's an older fish coming in the other direction, and the older fish says, "Hi boys, how's the water?" And the two little fish look at one another and they keep swimming along, and one of them turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" We're immersed in what these little fish are calling water. It's actually gravity. I've actually done experimentation showing that cellular phenotypes are lost in microgravity, for example. And I don't have enough time to really address all that, but I'll sort of touch on it as I go along. So life began ambiguously in the form of negative entropy, according to Schrödinger, the physicist who wrote the book, What is Life, published in 1944. And so that was actually the origin of the protocell, because positive entropy is what exists in the environment. So ever since we've been making up just so stories in order to cope with this ambiguity that we began with, we now have adequate data to relate our beginnings, ontology, and knowledge, epistemology, in order to start from the beginning instead of reasoning after the fact, which we know is illogical, but we think that's all we've got. So if we apply Occam's razor, the simplest answer is usually the correct one. And so I maintain that looking at the process of the evolution of life from a cellular perspective is actually much simpler than, for example, Darwin's tangled bank, which really is, again, there is, just to state unequivocally, there is no scientific evidence for Darwinian evolution, yet there's everything I'm going to roll out here is based upon scientific evidence from my laboratory and that of many others. So my hypothesis is that consciousness is our awareness of the cosmos as a concomitant of our physiology. I can't see the entire screen, Jeff. How do I get rid of myself? Can I do that? No? Okay.
No, I don't think you can, unfortunately.
Okay. So ontogeny is development. And we learned during my years in graduate school that that's actually mediated by cellular communication. It wasn't known before the late 1970s. Phylogeny or speciation is also cell communication. It's actually based upon the embryologic principle from a morphogenetic perspective. So therefore, ontogeny equals phylogeny, and actually Haeckel told us that back in the 18th century. It was his biogenetic law. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and he was actually right. He just didn't have the science to back that up. And so all of this is based upon cellular communication, which is where I come from in terms of understanding what consciousness actually constitutes. So in this slide, I'm showing how lipids that are generated by pulsars in deep space, when the Earth was finally cooled about 100 million years after it formed, lipids immersed in water, which came from asteroids that were frozen snowballs. Again, there's evidence for that. They spontaneously formed these micelles, and those micelles then allowed for this generation of negative entropy, what Schrödinger talked about, and in combination with chemiosmosis, an ability to maintain the negative entropic state, they were allowed to do so sustainably through homeostasis. But as I said earlier, gravity actually is what set all of this in motion, and it is necessary for life. And as contrary to popular belief as to so memory is necessary for evolution. And we normally think of biologic memory as DNA or RNA, when in fact that's derivative of what actually transpired when these micelles, which I'm showing here is this sphere with a dotted line, the semi-permeable membrane, those spheres were floating at or near the surface of the primordial ocean, covering the Earth, and when they were warmed, they would deform. And when they were cooled at night, in the absence of sunlight, they would reform. It's called hysteresis. This is a quality of lipids, which allows them to de and reform. And as they do so and expand and contract, they trapped calcium ions within themselves. And in our forebears, we managed to figure out a way to transport calcium in and out of the cell actively through these calcium channels, because to do otherwise, to not do that, would be tantamount to extinction, because calcium in high enough concentrations is toxic to lipid membranes and to life itself. So here I'm just trying to show this idea that if we start on the far left with a Big Bang, which generated the four forces, the four essential forces, primarily gravity, because that's the most relevant to biology, it actually forms a lattice work. So I'd like you to think about this lattice, because I'm going to use that, I'm going to lean on that heavily. And so, for example, there is a logic to the cosmos. The third book I published, Evolution, the Logic of Biology, I rationalized that, so the way stars generate light, it's referred to as nucleosynthesis. The first 36 elements of the periodic table were generated through the generation of starlight. And they fall in the sequence of their atomic mass. And so going back to the idea of symbiogenesis, the internalization of factors in the environment, life had to comply with the same logic, if you will. So our physiology complies with the same set of laws of nature that the cosmos does. So here I'm on the far left, I'm showing the relationship between ontogeny or embryonic development, in this case of a lung, with that of phylogeny, starting with in fish, going from fish to amphibia, reptilians, mammals, and birds, phylogenetically, starting with the fish swim bladder. And in fact, the cellular motifs that you see here for phylogeny and ontogeny are virtually the same thing. And until Einstein formulated the equation of energy equaling mass times this fudge factor, the square of the speed of light, it was questionable whether there was actually a singularity, as was proposed by the ancient Greeks. But now, as I proposed in a paper that I published in 2019, there is a singularity, and that singularity actually is also a lattice work. And the reason I think that that's correct is because of this concept of the symbiogenic principle, and how life and physics actually merge together in order to generate life forms. On the far right, I'm showing the relationship between, in this case, on the vertical axis, alveolarization, which is basically how the lung has evolved over time, against the time factor. And the origin, or this line of identity actually for high energy phosphates interacting for embryogenesis, passes through the origin of this Cartesian coordinate, and it is the origin is actually the Big Bang itself. So another concept to keep in mind here is a well-accepted principle in biology. It's referred to as terminal addition. So what I'm showing here with these squares is that as new traits have been added on over the course of evolution, through the cellular communication process that I referenced earlier, new traits are added only on to the end of this series of cellular adaptations. So we're going in time from left to right. This is actually where this lattice-like characteristic of life comes from, because this is the way in which morphogenesis and phylogeny actually roll out, if you will. So there is a sequence that has to be undergone. The underlying reason for that is because the cellular communication processes are highly articulated in terms of this cell, the cell on the left telling the cell on the right, I'm here and you should do X, either grow or differentiate, basically. And the way in which that's done is through the generation of high energy phosphates generated by receptors that react to protein ligands produced by the upstream cell itself. So, in retrospect, this chain of events has to occur because to introduce a new characteristic in the middle or at the beginning of this chain of events would be highly inefficient. And I would submit that the organism would not be able to survive. It would be tantamount to extinction. So I'm reasoning after the fact here, but that seems to be the reason why terminal addition occurs. As a graphic representation of what I'm talking about, I'm looking at the lung, the heart, and the kidney as they have evolved. At the very top, we start with the swim bladder of fish, which then evolved into the simple frog lung, and then the reptilian and bird lung, which I didn't show the bird lung here, but the mammalian lung. And basically, it's the ability of the alveoli to increase gas exchange by increasing the surface area to blood volume ratio. And that's accomplished through cellular interactions that are compliant with the principles of homeostasis. So similarly, we see, going from left to right, the fish heart, the simplest structure, just a thickened muscle in a vessel. Then you go to the right to the frog lung, which is a three-chambered heart. The bird lung, similarly, a three-chambered heart, and then finally the mammalian heart. I just wanted to reference something that was said earlier about the female consciousness issue. The atrium of the heart actually produces a hormone, and that hormone affects behavior. So I would be of the opinion that that's actually where these differences, I would propose that male and female hearts are producing different amounts of atrial natriuretic factor under different conditions, but that's just my bias, just to throw that in. So similarly, the kidney starts out as a much simpler structure in fish, largely because the fish is in water and the ions that it requires for life are readily available. But as we've evolved onto land over the last 500 million years, we had to adapt to the terrestrial environment. And so the glomerulus of the kidney became much more complex in terms of a vascular structure. And in reality, the glomerulus of the kidney has very strong homology to the alveolus of the lung. I don't have the time to go into that, but suffice it to say that they are very similar structures that just do different things using the same molecular motifs. So I'm just going to roll out this idea of where consciousness comes from, and this is a little bit messed up, but so physiologic stress has affected mammalian evolution, if you will, and largely through the effect of a serial state of hypoxia. So the lung is evolving as it's adapting to land, going from fish to frogs, reptiles, and mammals and birds. And it's referring all the way back in this cascade to the origins of life in these lipids immersed in water, because in order to evolve the alveolus, for example, you have to have the production of what's called lung surfactant, which reduces surface tension within the alveoli in order for them to become smaller and smaller in diameter to facilitate gas exchange. That's the strategy that's being used. But that all was initiated by gravity. And so this is referencing what I've called the first principles of physiology, which are enumerated: negative entropy, chemiosmosis, and homeostasis. So everything is evolving in reference to the origin in these first principles because of this memory capacity of the physiology. And then we can move forward again. And in the process of developing these physiologic traits, as we evolved on land, the aggregate of those physiologic traits, the internalization of factors in the environment that have posed existential threats, symbiogenesis concept, is actually how the cosmos maps onto our physiology. So what I'm saying is that our physiology, again, I'm repeating myself, but it warrants repeating, our physiology is actually where our consciousness dwells. And that's basically what integrated physiology constitutes. And as I said, consciousness is actually cosmic. Okay, so the way in which this works, to spell it out, again, is you have this semi-permeable membrane in unicellular organisms, which usually is thought of exclusively in terms of the Bohm's explicate order, which determines behavior. And because my laboratory at UCLA does epigenetic work, this behavioral explicate order dictates how we mosey around through our environment and looking for relatively small changes in the environment, not large changes necessarily, but small ones. And the ability to do that through left-right brain lateralization is actually what our phenotype is all about. It's not the sum total of our traits, as we would think of in terms of a retrospective kind of Darwinian way of thinking. And in tandem with this explicate order, which is the way we normally think about awareness or consciousness, is this underlying implicate order, again, a Bohm term for the entire cosmos, everything in existence. That's actually, as I've said numerous times now, that's actually what our physiology is constituted by and constitutes. And where that emerged from is through, when I thought about, well, where did symbiogenesis come from? Using this retrospective kind of analysis, it occurred to me that actually quantum entanglement and non-localization, which are quantum mechanical principles, would have likely been the antecedent of that symbiogenic principle. And the reason that is important is because the consensus is that everything in existence has to comply with quantum mechanics. But up until the paper that I distributed amongst you folks at the Society for Consciousness Studies, Life as a Mobius Strip, there had been no way to connect the dots between quantum entanglement or quantum mechanics and physiology. Try as one might. There are a couple of anecdotal examples. For example, the cells in the retina are actually able to detect single photons. That's well known now. Another example is how terrestrial, the way that birds determine position in space and time, because they have these iron particles within neurons in their brain, and that sort of allows them to orient themselves to the Earth. But these are just anecdotes, and one might expect that if in fact quantum mechanics is the underpinning of everything in existence, that there should be these examples, but they're very difficult to identify because we're not looking at it from a prima facie perspective, but from an end result perspective. So I encourage the quantum mechanical kind of thinking in understanding this process of evolving from quantum mechanics. So this idea predicts several deliverables, such as Chalmers' hard problem, which actually is an atavism of what I've been talking about. Why we see red when we injure ourselves. We're remembering when we first bled with an intact vascular system, for example, or phantom limb sensing that we have an itch in our big toe when we don't have a right leg any longer. That's to maintain the upstream physiology so that it doesn't atrophy before we can pass our genes on to the next generation. The oneness with the cosmos, the sense of something greater than ourselves, I think is because our physiology is reflective of the cosmos. The rationale for constraint of human activity, which we overarch our normal constraints, unlike every other species on the planet, because of our imagination, the evolution of our large central nervous system, in order to be able to picture ourselves in other than our actual physical reality. Meditation, I think, is a recapitulation of consciousness, and in so doing, we go from the brain to the gut brain to the skin brain, and it's ultimately in the skin brain that we actually have the most dramatic interface between our internal physiology and the external environment. And near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, Maslow peak experiences, the runner's high, all of these things are actually manifestations of how when our physiology is overwhelmed by or is washed over by neuroendocrine hormones like endorphins and oxytocin and vasopressin, those things cause what's called a wave collapse in quantum mechanics. And so you have this literal coming together of all of our physiology into a whole. And so this is why we feel in touch with our cosmologic origins. There's a real phenomenon underlying that. And so, for example, when Andrew Newberg talks about spirituality, yes, I think that that is a manifestation of what I'm talking about. It is another way of closing the gap between the implicate and explicate orders that exist within us. And I just want to quote T.S. Eliot: "We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started." I think that's what I've just expressed, and I find it interesting that the poets are always ahead of the curve. Robert Frost, in one of his notebooks, said that he defined life as that which can mix oil and water, which is what I've been talking about. I think that the reason for that is because language is really what's propelled our evolution as human beings, particularly when we had the printed word, which could extrapolate from one generation to the next. And in contrast to Wittgenstein, who talks about prose being constrained, the verb being constrained by subject and object, the poet is less constrained. And so it's more akin with the movement of energy through the system, if you will, which is, I think, where we actually do dwell. We think of ourselves as being material beings, but we're actually not. We're just energy flows, as Whitehead has tried to express. Well, I'd like to think that's a beginning and not an end. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We have time for questions, and there have been quite a few comments in the chat box. If you can see the chat box,
No.
Might be a good idea to scroll back through there, see if there's anything you want to comment on.
Not down to me yet. Oh, I see. Okay, got it. Somebody said that's the whole problem. I don't quite know what Armin is referring to. No, that's Andrew again. Where do I start, Jeff?
You know, Tubi's got a question. If you wanna, we want to bring him in with a voice question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
First of all, John, I really thank you very much for wonderful presentations. Not a presentation, but I think wonderful research and work. And which is brilliant. In the first time that I haven't read you before, so it was very, very interesting in what you're saying. Thank you. Many years ago, when I was a student, I also studied physics, but I took one course in evolution. And I was very disappointed to see that the course, which is neo-Darwinism, really didn't explain properly, because I agree with you that the neo-Darwinism gives a real explanation to evolution. But from what you're saying, there is a lot of truth that's wonderful, but there is one thing which is missing, which is the intention. And I want to explain. When I realized this, and one of the reasons I didn't agree with the standard evolution, that such wonderful life cannot just develop by accident. Even if it's so many possibilities, it cannot evolve by accident. And what you describe is consciousness that reflects in everything. But what you didn't mention, that the consciousness got intention. So the life is not something that's created by coincidence, that some energy and flow and gravity. But all this is reflected of intention of the, not just of the consciousness, this consciousness reflects in every cell in every animal, because every animal have got intention to live.
Yes.
And to multiply in some way. And this intention is part of the evolution. And what you describe is a reflection of this from physics and cells. But beyond all this, there is one thing which is missing in science today and missing in physics, is intention. And it's another dimension that we cannot see. That's just, I want to know what you think about this. And I will love to collaborate with you about this.
Yeah, look, I've been writing about this for 25 years, so my apologies. But my thought process is that gravity impinges on. So when gravity impinges on my cell, a curved surface, it generates energy. That's Einstein's field theory. That supports the quantum entanglement and non-localization principles. But it's how the the organism pushes back against gravity, which is the intentionality. So I published a paper on the phenotype as agency, for example, because we've misunderstood what phenotype actually is. Epigenetics is the black matter of biology. So we do this kind of work in my laboratory. It's clear to me that we're only beginning to understand what our being is. So for example, in physics, the double slit experiment, I never understood it, but now offering the opportunity to think about this two-track or two-tiered system of implicate and explicate. Yeah, now when you look at the beam of light, it's particles because that's the explicate. You turn away, it's the implicate. So I finally understand what is this, mysterious, what Einstein called spooky, physics.
Yes.
Okay.
So the point that I want to mention that it's also missing in physics today, the intention or will is something so important in the universe that physics just ignore, and each one of us feeling it.
I agree, but
Thank you
I
very
think
much.
it's because of this lack of understanding of what consciousness is, because we're kind of in a ditch with both biology and physics being probabilistic. They're not.
Yes.
We have a purpose. Our purpose is to acquire information over our life cycle in order to give information to the upcoming offspring in order to be able to adapt.
Exactly.
So
this is a conscious evolution. So you can see behind all this is a plan of conscious evolution that all of us contribute to. Thank you very much, John.
Well, I just thank you very much. Let's get.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Let's get Julie in for one question here. She's got her hand up.
Hi, John. How are you doing today?
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I get 3 quick questions. Question number 1, what do you think about tensor integrity or tensile integrity, like how tension and compression works together? Number 2, how do you see, what do you think about membrane potential being changed by our breathing? Like every breath we take, it's my understanding that there's something going on with the membrane potential. Number 3, how do you see research into the phonons going on? I'm not talking photons, I'm talking phonons. Thanks.
Yeah, so my 30 years of funding to study parathyroid hormone-related protein, it's a stretch-regulated gene. So the gravitational effects on physiology are really poorly understood. I think that that's what you're talking about. And the reason I got funded is because if you delete that gene in a mouse, the mouse dies shortly after birth because it doesn't form alveoli, but it also doesn't calcify the skeleton. It does skin doesn't form properly. It's what's called a pleiotropic gene. Yes. So I think that that's what you're alluding to. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but yes, there's a lot that we don't understand about our physical interaction with the environment at the molecular level, but it's coming. And I think it has to, that's going to elucidate a lot of the things you asked about.